The pistol was slippery with blood. It was the summer of 1943, deep inside the grinding hell of the Eastern Front. A Soviet officer, his unit shattered, his men scattered across a smoking wheat field, raised his TT-33 to fire. The magazine dropped free. Not because he pressed the release, not because he chose to, it simply fell. A common fault in that pistol, especially in the chaos of close combat. He fumbled for it in the mud. A German soldier saw him do it. He did not survive. That small mechanical failure was not unique. It was documented. It was complained about in field reports sent up through the chain of command, piling up on desks in Moscow, adding to a mountain of evidence that the weapon the Red Army had trusted since 1931 was, in ways that mattered most, failing the men who carried it. This is the story of two pistols. One that won a world war and one that replaced it. It's the story of what the Soviet Union learned from the bloodiest conflict in human history, and how a quiet engineer from a small Russian town translated that lesson into a weapon that would serve soldiers and spies for 4 decades. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it now. We cover military history the way it deserves. No myths, no shortcuts, just the real story. Let's go back to the beginning. The TT-33, the Tula Tokarev, model 1933, did not appear out of nowhere. It was the answer to a very specific Soviet problem. By the late 1920s, the Red Army was still carrying the Nagan M1895, a revolver designed before the turn of the century. It was a relic, a weapon conceived in the age of cavalry charges and duel culture, now asked to serve in an industrialized military preparing for modern warfare. Soviet leaders recognized this was unacceptable. They needed a modern semi-automatic pistol, something powerful, something that could be mass-produced, something distinctly Soviet. They turned to Fedor Tokarev. Tokarev was already a legend inside Soviet arms circles. Born in 1871, he had been designing weapons since before the First World War. He understood machinery, metallurgy, and above all, the brutal economics of production at scale. When Soviet military officials issued their requirement for a new sidearm in 1930, Tokarev entered a design competition that drew submissions from several top engineers. His design won. The TT-30 was adopted by the Red Army in 1931. A refined version, the TT-33, followed shortly after. It was chambered in the 7.62 Con 25mm Tokarev cartridge, a round derived from the German 7.63mm Mauser. This was a hot, fast, bottleneck cartridge, high velocity, flat trajectory. Excellent penetration through thick clothing, leather, and even soft cover. By the standards of the day, it was a genuinely impressive round. The pistol itself drew heavily from the work of John Moses Browning, particularly the mechanism of the Colt M1911. Tokarev adapted and simplified Browning's swinging link system, cutting the parts count to reduce manufacturing complexity. The result was a lean, powerful pistol. By the time the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Red Army had received more than 600,000 TT-33 pistols. Before the war ended, over 1 million more would be produced. On the surface, those numbers sound like a success story. But the front lines tell a different story. In the chaos of World War II, the TT-33's weaknesses became impossible to ignore. The most dangerous flaw was the lack of a manual safety. The TT-33 had only a half-cock notch on the hammer, a passive feature that offered minimal protection against accidental discharge. For cavalry units, for tank crews working in cramped compartments, for soldiers sprinting through rubble under fire, this was a serious problem. Cossack cavalry units famously refused the TT-33 precisely because of this. They continued carrying the Nagant revolver, the old relic they were supposed to have retired. Because at least a revolver did not go off unexpectedly. Think about that. The Red Army was fighting the most technologically advanced military in the world, and its cavalry was choosing 19th-century revolvers over its official standard sidearm. Then there was the magazine problem. The TT-33's magazine release was poorly positioned and poorly engineered. Under stress, in the cold, with gloved hands, the magazine could drop free of the pistol unintentionally. Multiple field reports documented this failure. Soviet officers, the primary users of sidearms in the Red Army, were losing their only means of self-defense at the worst possible moments. There were other issues. Tankers complained that the TT-33 was poorly suited to firing through a tank viewport, a specific tactical requirement in armored warfare. The pistol was bulky by officer carry standards. It had accuracy limitations beyond close range. And the high-pressure 7.62mm Tokarev cartridge, while powerful, created stress on the firing pin that shortened the pistol's service life under field conditions. The Soviets recognized these problems early. As far back as 1938, 3 years before the German invasion, they were already conducting trials for a replacement. A designer named Pavel Voyevodin produced a promising 18-round design. It was selected for further development. Then the Germans crossed the border, and everything changed. Production facilities were evacuated east. Engineers were redirected to the weapons that could win the war immediately: rifles, submachine guns, artillery. The pistol replacement project was put on hold. The Red Army fought through 4 of the most brutal years in the history of armed conflict, carrying a pistol that was already under review for replacement before the first shot was fired. When it was finally over, when Berlin fell and the guns went quiet, the Soviets went back to that unfinished project. This time, they were not going to wait. In December 1945, the Soviet Ministry of Defense issued a formal requirement for a new service pistol. Not one competition. 2 simultaneous competitions. One for a 7.62mm design, one for a 9mm design. The emphasis was clear. The new pistol needed a manual safety. It needed to be smaller and lighter than the TT-33. It needed to be more reliable under harsh conditions. It needed to be simple to manufacture and simple to field strip. And critically, it needed to be something a soldier could carry holstered all day without worrying that it would kill him accidentally. The specification reflected every lesson the war had taught. Among the engineers who entered this competition was a relatively junior designer named Nikolai Fyodorovich Makarov. Makarov was born on May 22, 1914, in the village of Sasovo, in the Ryazan region of Russia. His father was a railway worker. His family was working class, not connected to the military or the arms industry. He enrolled at the Tula Mechanical Institute in 1936. Tula being the historic heart of Russian arms manufacturing, a city that had been producing weapons since the time of Peter the Great. When the Germans launched their invasion in June 1941, Makarov was weeks away from graduation. He was hastily certified as an engineer and immediately sent to the Zagorsky Machine Works. The factory was soon evacuated further east as German forces advanced. Makarov found himself working on submachine gun production in the Kirov Oblast, under the supervision of Georgy Shpagin, the designer of the PPSH-41, the iconic Soviet submachine gun that would become one of the defining weapons of the Second World War. Makarov later said that Shpagin was one of the greatest influences of his career. Working beside a man who understood how to design a weapon for mass production, for a country under siege, desperate for weapons, left a permanent mark on how Makarov thought about engineering. He finally returned to Tula in 1944 and completed his degree with honors. The following year, 1945, he entered the pistol competition. He was 31 years old. He was competing against some of the most experienced weapons designers in the Soviet Union. Men like Sergei Korovin, Pavel Voyevodin, and Sergei Simonov, engineers with decades of experience and established reputations. By any conventional measure, Makarov was the underdog. The design that Makarov brought to that competition was not a completely original concept. He was not working in a vacuum, and he never claimed to be. During the final year of the war, Soviet engineers and intelligence officers had gained access to significant amounts of captured German military technology. Among the weapons they examined closely was the Walther PP, the Polizeipistole, a German police and military sidearm that had been in service since 1929. The Walther PP was chambered in a relatively modest caliber, but it was well regarded for its reliability, its double-action trigger, and its compact, practical design. Makarov studied the Walther PP carefully. He also had access to information about a wartime German development called the Walther Ultra, an enlarged PP variant that had been designed for military use but never entered wide production. He absorbed what worked about these German designs, then he rebuilt them. The cartridge was also reimagined. A Soviet engineer named Boris Vladimirovich Semin had designed a new round in 1946, the 9 Kerks 18mm Makarov. It was deliberately calibrated to exist between two established cartridges. It was more powerful than the 380 ACP, a common European cartridge, but less powerful than the 9-gun 19mm Parabellum used by NATO. This was not accidental. The 9 Kerks 18 meters was the most powerful cartridge that could reliably function in a simple, blowback-operated pistol. The operating system Makarov chose for simplicity and reliability. In a blowback design, there is no complex locking mechanism. The slide is held closed only by the recoil spring and its own mass. When the cartridge fires, the pressure pushes the slide backward against the spring's resistance, which ejects the spent case and loads the next round. It is mechanically simple. Fewer parts means fewer things to break. In Arctic cold, in Central Asian dust, in the mud of a firefight, simplicity is survival. Makarov's pistol had 27 major parts. It could be field-stripped completely without tools. It had a double-action trigger, meaning a soldier could chamber a round, lower the hammer safely, and still fire immediately with a single long pull of the trigger. A crucial safety feature the TT-33 had never offered, and it had a real manual safety lever, on the slide, within easy reach of the thumb, something Cossack cavalrymen had died wishing for. The trials in April 1948 were decisive. Makarov's pistol was tested against competing designs from Baryshev and Sevryugin, both experienced engineers, both submitting serious contenders. The results were not close. Makarov's pistol experienced 20 times fewer malfunctions than either competitor. It required fewer parts than any rival design. Its reliability under extreme conditions was consistently superior. Soviet authorities selected Makarov's design in 1949 for final development and mass production preparation. Tooling was established at the Izhevsk mechanical plant, the same city where Mikhail Kalashnikov's AK-47 was being prepared for production. In December 1951, the Pistolet Makarova, the PM, was formally adopted by the Soviet armed forces. For his achievement, Nikolai Makarov received the Stalin Prize, 3rd degree. The railway worker's son from Sasovo had beaten the most experienced designers in the Soviet Union and created the weapon that would arm Soviet officers, KGB agents, cosmonauts, and Warsaw Pact soldiers for 4 decades. He received the honor quietly. He accepted the recognition with the same reserved practicality that defined everything about how he worked. His wife Nadezhda later recalled that when Makarov was designing the pistol, he never told her what he was working on. He simply came home each evening and went back to Tula each morning. The weapon that would bear his name, that would eventually be produced in numbers exceeding 10 million, was something she learned about only after the fact. The PM entered service in 1951 and immediately demonstrated why the Soviet military had chosen it. It was issued to officers, non-commissioned officers, military police, KGB personnel, and the crews of tanks and aircraft, exactly the population of soldiers who most needed a reliable, safe, compact sidearm. The double-action trigger allowed a soldier to draw and fire in a single motion without first cocking the hammer. The manual safety worked intuitively. The pistol could be completely disassembled and reassembled in under a minute without tools. In the field, it proved extraordinarily durable. Soviet service reports confirmed near-zero stoppages even after thousands of rounds fired without cleaning. In Arctic temperatures that caused mechanical lubricants to freeze and weapons to seize, the Makarov kept functioning. The simplicity that Makarov had learned from watching Shpagin design the PPSH-41, that obsession with reducing parts, reducing complexity, reducing the ways a weapon could fail, paid off in conditions that broke more sophisticated designs. The 9X at 18mm Makarov cartridge was, by NATO standards, modest in power. Western critics, who would later examine the pistol, noted its relatively limited stopping power compared to the 45 ACP or 9X 19mm Parabellum. But the Soviet military had made a deliberate calculation. A pistol is not a soldier's primary weapon. Officers carried it for self-defense, for control of prisoners, for situations where a rifle was unavailable or impractical. For that role, the 9x 18mm Makarov was more than adequate, and its lower pressure made the blowback system reliable, the recoil manageable, and the manufacturing economical. Within a decade, the PM was adopted across the Warsaw Pact. East Germany produced it as the Pistole M. Bulgaria manufactured it under license. China produced the Type 59, a near-identical copy, for the People's Liberation Army. By the 1960s, the weapon born from that 1945 design competition had become the standard sidearm of the communist world. The TT-33, meanwhile, was not simply discarded. It was handed off to Allied nations, to liberation movements, to African states receiving Soviet military aid, to the Chinese and North Koreans and Vietnamese who would carry it through decades of further conflict. Over 60 countries would ultimately use the TT-33 in some capacity. The pistol that the Soviets deemed inadequate became one of the most widely distributed firearms in the history of the 20th century. There is one detail about the Makarov pistol's history that is easy to overlook but hard to forget once you know it. The Soviet space program included the PM in the survival kit of cosmonauts traveling aboard Vostok spacecraft. It was packed alongside food rations, a compass, and signaling equipment for use if a cosmonaut came down in hostile territory after re-entry. The pistol that Makarov designed in a small office in Tula, the pistol that came out of lessons learned in the blood and mud of the Eastern Front, became the first firearm ever launched into space. That is a remarkable journey for any object. That it was a pistol designed specifically to address the failures of a wartime weapon, created by a quiet engineer who never talked about his work, makes it something more. It is evidence that great engineering often comes from the most unglamorous place possible. From a list of complaints, from field reports, from the accumulated testimony of men who almost died because a magazine fell out at the wrong moment. Nikolai Makarov retired from arms design in 1974. He was awarded the title Hero of Socialist Labor that same year. He spent his retirement as a member of the Soviet of Working People's Deputies in Tula Oblast, a local civic role that suited his temperament, modest, practical, grounded. He enjoyed fishing in local ponds. He died on May 13, 1988. He had suffered 6 previous heart attacks. The 7th took him. He was 73 years old. A bust honoring him was placed on the Tula Gunsmiths Walk of Fame in 2015, and a monument was erected in his hometown of Sasovo in 2019. Fyodor Tokarev, the man whose pistol Makarov's design replaced, lived to be 96. He died in 1968, long enough to see the PM adopted, long enough to see the weapon he spent decades perfecting set aside. History does not record what he thought of the young engineer who replaced him. But the engineering record is clear. The Makarov addressed every significant weakness of the TT-33. It was safer, more reliable, easier to carry, and far more practical for the role it was designed to fill. The TT-33 was a wartime weapon. It was built for a moment when the Soviet Union needed millions of pistols produced as fast as possible, at any cost, with whatever quality the situation permitted. It served that moment well. It went to war with the Red Army and came back with it. The Makarov was a peacetime weapon, or more precisely, a Cold War weapon. It was built for a different kind of conflict, one defined not by mass frontal assault, but by intelligence operations, by officers stationed at remote garrisons, by cosmonauts and KGB agents and military policemen who might draw their sidearm once in their entire career. For that world, the Makarov was exactly right. 2 pistols, 2 eras. One continuous thread of Soviet military experience, flowing from the muddy fields of the Eastern Front to the silence of space. The lesson of this story is not really about pistols. It is about what institutions do with failure, whether they bury it or learn from it. The Soviet military, for all its brutality and bureaucracy, did something right after World War II. They collected the complaints, they read the field reports, they listened to the Cossacks who refused the TT-33. They heard the officers who had fumbled for fallen magazines in the mud. And then they built a competition designed to fix every single problem that had been documented. They did not ask for a more powerful pistol. They did not ask for a flashier design. They asked for a safer one, a more reliable one that a soldier under pressure could trust. They got it. That is a lesson that has nothing to do with the Soviet Union, or with pistols, or with the Cold War. It is a lesson about what it means to take experience seriously. To let the hard-earned knowledge of people in the field reshape the decisions made in headquarters. To build not for the war you want to fight, but for the war you actually fought, and the one you expect to fight next. Nikolai Makarov never commanded armies. He never led men into battle. He spent his career in offices and factories, working with metal and springs and tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. But the weapon he built was shaped by the experiences of men who did all of those things. Men who fought and bled and died in the most destructive war in human history, and who left behind, in their complaints and their field reports, a precise description of what they needed. He listened, he built it, and it flew into space. If this story gave you something to think about, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Ring the bell so you never miss a new video. We put out military history that is thoroughly researched, honestly told, and built on primary sources, because the real stories are always more compelling than the myths. We'll see you in the next one.